There have been a lot of questions about the constitutionality, constitutional interpretations of a few decisions you've made. So I just simply ask, do you believe the War Powers Act is constitutional?
President Obama's constitutional exegesis on Libya. President Obama replied to Chuck Todd's question by not answering the question and entering into a defense of his Libyan war.
Now, when you look at the history of the War Powers Resolution, it came up after the Vietnam War, in which we had 500,000 soldiers there, tens of thousands of lives lost, hundreds of billions of dollars spent. And Congress said, you know what, we don't want something like that happening again. So if you're going to start getting us into those kinds of commitments, you've got to consult with Congress beforehand. And I think that such consultation is entirely appropriate. But do I think that our actions in any way violate the War Powers Resolution? The answer is no. So I don't even have to get to the constitutional question. There may be a time in which there was a serious question as to whether or not the War Powers Resolution Act was constitutional. I don't have to get to the question.
But is President Obama's explanation a fair description of his powers under the Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Resolution? No, in both cases. The War Powers Resolution has been criticized by neoconservatives and interventionists generally as unconstitutionally infringing upon the powers of the president to take the nation to war, to interfere, if you will, with the unitary presidency. Honest critics of the War Powers Resolution in the traditionalist right have claimed the exact opposite, that the War Powers Resolution was an unconstitutional authorization for 90 days of presidential wars. Both sides are wrong. The traditional right is closer to the truth when it comes to the War Powers Resolution under the U.S. Constitution, but wrong with regard to the War Powers Resolution itself. The War Powers Resolution explicitly says it does not authorize presidential wars. Section 2 of the resolution says, quote, "The constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief to introduce United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised pursuant to 1. A declaration of war, 2. Specific statutory authorization, or 3. A national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories, possessions, or its armed forces." In other words, the War Powers Resolution says the President's power to command U.S. troops into war is based solely on either explicit affirmative approval by Congress or a sudden attack on the United States in circumstances when Congress cannot be called into session. And the War Powers Act requires the President to remove troops from harm's way within 90 days of one of those sudden attacks on the United States. In the case of Libya, President Obama made no case that Muammar Gaddafi had made a sudden attack against the United States. Section 8 of the War Powers Resolution even goes so far as to state that the resolution itself, as well as any treaties the United States has signed, is not a license to wage war for 90 days. Quote, "Authority to introduce the United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations wherein involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances shall not be inferred or construed as granting any authority with respect to the introduction of United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, which authority he would not have had in the absence of this joint resolution." The War Powers Resolution is in line with what the Founding Fathers wanted. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Elbridge Gerry, Oliver Ellsworth, and George Mason debated changing the Congress's power over war from make to declare. According to James Madison's notes at the convention agreed that no republic would place the power to declare war in the hands of the executive branch, as a president could not be safely trusted to it. The Constitution says Congress shall have the power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, to make rules concerning captures on land and water, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. In other words, absent an imminent invasion, the Constitution says Congress has the sole authority to place American troops in harm's way. and the president has none of these powers. It's Congress's job to punish crimes against the laws of nation, as Muammar Gaddafi is accused of. Congress has all the powers of war and all the powers over the military. As Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Paper, number 69, the president's power would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as First General and Admiral of the Confederacy. Comparing that to the King of England, while that of the King extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. So just as a general who has command of CENTCOM in Europe cannot start a war, neither can the president do so. President Obama says his constitutional obligation is giving Congress information on wars he starts.
And throughout this process, we consulted with Congress. We've had 10 hearings on it. We've sent reams of information about what the operations are. I've had all the members of Congress over to talk about it. So a lot of this fuss is politics. And if you look substantively at what we've done, we have done exactly what we said to do under a UN mandate, and we have protected thousands of lives in the process. And as a consequence, a guy who was a state sponsor of terrorist operations against the United States of America is pinned down, and the noose is tightening around him.
But the Constitution is clear. He doesn't need to give information. He needs to get permission from Congress, and he doesn't have it. President Obama told the press,
I'm not a Supreme Court justice, so I'm not going to put my constitutional law professor hat on here.
But perhaps President Obama ought to put on his constitutional law professor hat and begin to follow the U.S. Constitution and the War Powers Resolution.